This is He Who Moans, Doctor Who reviews. I only complain because I like Doctor Who and I care. And I overanalyze too much because, whatever, it's just my opinion. An introduction to the Charlie era. So, the first run of 8th Doctor adventures on Bigfinish, the one that I always bang on about. The early 8th Doctor plays appear to be less popular among Bigfinish fans in hindsight. Many people seem to prefer the Lucy era, and I do kinda see why, in spite of my obviously disagreeing, speaking as a raging fanboy for the Charlie ones. Though, yes, the Lucy ones mostly have the sharper writing, and are probably a better starting point for newcomers to the 8th Doctor, albeit a much more expensive one. It's like they're actively trying to bankrupt me. My soft spot for the Charlie era is probably partly based on my nostalgia for it. Mostly in some cases, which I'll get to, as its flaws are pretty big and obvious, but when this era hits, you can't deny that it hits pretty fucking hard. The reason the first era is less popular is probably because the Charlie era reads like a company trying to find its feet, which I've only really noticed upon listening back to it in the years since I first stumbled across them. Because at this point, the Bigfinish team were relatively new writer-producers who were picked up on the strengths of their fan audio series that they were making prior to being handed some doctors and assistants by the BBC, and now they were in the situation of previously having been fan fiction writers, having to forge their own identity as an independent production company, while also trying to figure out how they'd achieve longevity. And so in Bigfinish's early days, there was quite a lot of experimentation going on. They worked on a trial and error basis, and rightly so in my book. They said to themselves, right, we have to make at least one 4-part long Doctor Who play a month, let's try lots of different things and see what works and see what doesn't. Because if they'd only picked 4 or 5 ideas and stuck repeating the same things all the time, there is no way that they'd still be here 15 years down the line. So when it came to their first stab at cultivating a series of adventures for the screen elusive 8th Doctor, they decided to dedicate entire blocks of releases in their ongoing monthly series to what were termed seasons for his adventures, and attempted to patchwork his ongoing stories together into a grand epic space opera, kind of similar to what Moffat was trying to do with Season 6, but personally I feel this is a bit more of a cohesive effort. It was a brave move for such a young company to go ahead with such a hefty design for a follow-up series to the infamously failed, poorly received TV movie, and if done badly, it would have been a bit of a dampener on their reputation so early in their lifetime, as at that point, 2001, the movie's reputation was much worse than it is now. It seems to be looked back on much more charitably by fandom in hindsight. And if this series had failed, it would have kinda looked like an inherently stupid move for them. And though I love the shit out of the Charlie era, many complain that what they came out with ended up long, convoluted and hard to follow at times, and yeah, I see where people that say that are coming from, particularly when we get to the Divergent arc, but I personally don't think said elements of long, convoluted really detract from the separate stories as often as people say they do, because you can listen to stuff like, say, Chimes of Midnight, Natural History of Fear and Time Works, for example, completely out of context, because I know that I did. And also, people that have levelled this at the Charlie era, what you got to remember is that if you look at the Charlie era alongside what was the original intended plan for the series for the 8th Doctor, which was detailed in what was termed the Leakley Bible, it was originally going to be a series of remakes of classic episodes. It reimagined the Cybermen as the Sibs, a group of space pirates, and in this version, the Master and the Doctor are actually brothers who are searching for their father, who is called Ulysses. So yeah, that there is why, in spite of the occasional levels of way too much ambition on display in the Charlie era, I think it deserves the respect I'm going to give it because, holy Christ, does the Leakley Bible set every single complaint I have ever levelled of anything in this franchise in perspective. And to be honest, while I will draw attention to them and admit that they're there and quite blatant, I can look past the Charlie era's flaws. I will address them, but mostly because if I didn't, I'd look like a massive hypocrite. Well, I'm probably gonna look like a massive hypocrite anyway, as lots of these opinions will be unpopular, but just know that when I do start picking at its flaws, I will start dying inside. Do you see what you have done, people accusing me of being a massive hypocrite? You did this! We start with Storm Warning, which is your standard sci-fi historical piece. You know the drill, insert famous event from history that you may be familiar with here, add aliens, and boom, you got a Doctor Who story. It's a traditional formula that you'll instantly recognise that's traceable all the way back to the Time Meddler. Going back into history and rewriting it around elements of the show, and while you could accuse Storm Warning of playing it safe with such a tried and tested formula, it's a really decent execution of said formula, and opening stories tend to do that anyway, so you kind of know where you are with this Doctor. It sees him winding up on board the doomed airship, the R-101. As you knew they'd go ahead with based on this premise, the airship runs into aliens, and the overgrown man-child in me must make note of the fact it features space pterodactyls. Why does it feature space pterodactyls? Because why the fuck not? Can you think of one reason why not? And it sees the introduction of 8's first off-screen companion, who I'm a huge fan of, Charlie Pollard. Edwardian adventuress who, growing tired of her upper-class background, abandons her family and jumps ship hoping to travel to Singapore. On board, she runs into the Doctor and finds with him the opportunity to not just travel the world, but travel the whole of time and space, which obviously she jumps at. She's kind of very similar to Perry in that respect. You know, when it comes to motivation, that's what Doctor Who companions should be all about, travel and adventure. Ahem. But what was really interesting to me was no one from present-day Earth being in the TARDIS meant that Charlie, acting as the audience avatar, could offer a unique alternative take on events from a past perspective. You'll never stumble across companion Doctor conversations quite like ones between the 8th Doctor and Charlie. There's just something really warm and inviting about the way they play off each other. And companions offering a perspective from another time period is something I really wish the new series would take advantage of. Like, Time Machine, remember? And the Doctor saving her from the doomed airship started us on the First Era's initial story arc, which is all about the web of time that holds the fabric of the universe together, cracking because something important's changed. Now that Charlie survived the crash, that seemingly minute but apparently highly important detail spends the rest of this run creating paradoxes rippling out from it, and is one of the primary causes of many of the weird, crazy events that the Doctor and Charlie show up to deal with. It's an interesting development in the general time travel paradigm of why can't the Doctor just go back in time and save anyone he wants to? Because it can literally break apart the universe. Really, I just gotta love that premise for this era. Overall, Storm Warning's pretty good for what it is. It's conventional and is very clearly a pilot and it knows it, but it's a great story in its own right, and Paul McGann and India Fisher are instantly a lot of fun, and of course, fucking space pterodactyls, which are never a bad thing. Next up, we have Sword of Orion, penned by Dalek Voices himself, Nick Briggs, one of the founders of Bigfinish, and one of their most prolific writers. Many of his stories are covered in My Tongue Stains, particularly To the Death and Creatures of Beauty. Briggs quite obviously had the leftover impression of the Sidemen from 80s Who that lots of people had, particularly Silver Nemesis here, that being, oh, for God's sake already, they are not just men in tinfoil, they are meant to be horrifying. And Bigfinish's first ever Sidemen play does make that intention with them very clear. The Doctor and Charlie board a derelict spaceship drifting in space where the Sidemen have lain dormant for centuries and face off against a scavenger crew out to recycle the assets, while trying not to wake the Sidemen up, which, duh, obviously they do. Seriously, it's a Doctor Who play here. Did you not see that one coming? This has turned out to be quite a divisive one in hindsight, and while I do have a soft spot for it as it was one of my first Bigfinish plays, but on returning to it many years later, from what I've heard Bigfinish do since this point in their catalogue, on a recent re-listen, it does feel more like the company trying to find its feet than it initially appeared to be at the time. There are a few early Briggs stories which are quite obviously him trying to perfect an audio rendition of the traditional Base Under Siege formula, which lots of us love the bus formula, particularly Second Doctor fans like myself, and while this one executes it pretty well, there is a glaring flaw in it that lots of people are very likely to notice. The twist at the climax you can pretty much see coming a mile off, because you can probably plainly tell just by listening to it that what ideas are there are clearly an homage to the Alien franchise, and while I love the Alien franchise, and you'd think that anything building off of its ideas would succeed on the merits of said ideas being good ones to begin with, but unfortunately I have to be the guy to point out that you can only go so far on trying desperately hard to wear something else's skin. There's a very fine line between derivative in a fun way and derivative in a, well, just that way. I wouldn't exactly call it an attempt to blanketly rip Alien off, as it's clearly aware of its own influences and adds enough of its own stuff to it. It's well executed pulp sci-fi if nothing else, and
As said, I do still have a soft spot for it, but upon listening back to it, I'd be lying if I didn't say that it wears the fact that Bigfinish were still a very young company treading water at this point on its sleeve. Oh my god, the dying has started. Help me. Stones of Venice is next up, and I found I liked this one a lot more on re-listens than I initially did at the time. At the time I thought it was just okay, but I've come to feel that it's a little bit misjudged by people, because saying everything about it out loud, there's a really pretty little creative spark to this story. The Doctor and Charlie end up in Venice in the far future, where the city's sinking into the ocean, which is a tragedy that the population seem to have accepted, and no one seems to have managed to figure out a way of stopping it from sinking for some reason, and it doesn't seem to be considered a problem. Yet many seem to dislike this one because it's a bit jarring that while it's set far in the future, the setting and characters seem to all be stuck in the 18th century. It's all castles and old-timey aesthetics, and with a plot that's very, very traditionalist fairy tale. It's primarily about a lovesick aristocrat's long-dead lover, there's an underground cult in the city, a missing corpse, and a rebellion by the city's web-footed amphibious gondoliers. Weird, yes, but personally I ain't got a problem with that. It kind of plays out like an early Hartnell historical with a bit of a weird conceit to it. I will admit it takes a while to get going, but the world that Paul Meagher's fleshed out here I found to be really vivid and charismatic. It's also surrounded with some really beautiful little speeches. It gives the Eighth Doctor the chance to fully unleash the hopeless romantic in him that he's famous for being, and it's ended up being one of my favourite performances from McGann. Really, don't let people tell you this one's filler. Personally think it's highly underrated. Minuet in Hell finishes up the Eighth Doctor's first series, the first cheesy overblown B-movie nonsense, which would become a running trend much to lots of people sighing, and me jumping up and down like a child on a sugar high. Talking about this one's going to be fun. It's the US in the near future, well, near future as written by 2001, in a fictional new state that's just been created, and for some stupid reason, someone's decided to call it, can't fucking believe I'm saying this, Malbolgia. Wow, great name, guys. That totally screams, come to our state. It's a lovely place to visit. Seriously, if that was your final decision on what the name should be, what did other suggestions include? Place where bad things will obviously happen. Have a nice day. It's assumed to be somewhere in the Bible Belt where the Doctor is in a mental institute and has lost his memory for what feels like the billionth time, while Charlie is working at the Hellfire Club, a real exclusive secret society from the 1700s who've summoned a demonic creature from another dimension called Marcosius. This one is incredibly divisive, like most works that Gary Russell's name's directly attached to the writing credit of. Some people like it, lots of people hate it, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I like it, as it will probably lose me a lot of credibility as a critic. Well, assuming I had any to lose, debatable topic, have fun with that one, comment section. I can see why people hate it. There's a lot to hate about it. It's incredibly goofy and silly. It has a lot of really offensively stupid jokes in it. Almost all of its characters are stereotypes. Charlie gets treated appallingly. A lot of aspects of the plot are really, really silly, and while it does mostly explain itself, it doesn't exactly explain itself that well, as even as someone who likes it, even I will admit this story barely does anything well. But the thing that clicked with me with Minuet in Hell when I first listened to it when I was a teenager is it's so deranged, so crazy and outright insane a story that, yes, its tone is all over the place and lots of it just doesn't really fit with Doctor Who, but what I would call it is an attempt to write Doctor Who like it's the Evil Dead. Because just when you think things have calmed down, suddenly a demon breaks in and starts screaming at everyone and threatening to eat their faces. Like, yes, it's cartoony, but I guess I enjoy it for similar reasons that I enjoy lots of stupid sci-fi horror B movies. I mean, sure, it's not deep, but it's not trying to be, and, you know, sometimes that can be fine by me. Lots of the plotting decisions are outright baffling, yes. It does feel every bit the fanfiction it was initially written as, and its metric shit ton of problems, which it doesn't exactly make that much effort to hide, have put many people off it, but for such mad shit as this to get put out under the Doctor Who name, I guess I just appreciate it for being as crazy and stupid as it is, though yes, I do agree, inevitable people in the comments, I am being far too kind to it for what it actually is. So yeah, that was the opening series, and while it doesn't try and hide the fact that they're still a very young company forging their own identity, this was a decent start, particularly Stones of Venice, and I had fun with it, and they're also really cheap to download on the Bigfinish website, and... Christ, I am fucking just becoming an advert, aren't I? Okay, I'm gonna go and vomit in shame now. Join me next time.